Pleasant good afternoon, everyone. My brief presentation this afternoon argues that the paradigm of European expansionism and the mercantilist principles were buttressed by the actions of merchants and planters like Constance Sylvester, who atomized the imperialist paradigm. Constance Sylvester, animated by this worldview and a rich commercial heritage, did not regard discrete territorial or national boundaries as a limit to his business endeavors. Now, I've chosen the word hyper-capitalism to describe the type of capitalist endeavors with which the European imperialist powers would have engaged. And I chose this term because I think it contextualizes quite well the extreme profit-seeking, global integration of supply chains, the scientific and industrial scale of agriculture, the ruthless exploitation and state-sanctioned barbarity which was exemplified in the treatment of indigenous, indentured, and enslaved labor. The entrepreneurial career of Constance Sylvester is fascinating. In spite of the fragmentary archival record, we may conclude that he was single-minded in his pursuit of wealth by any means. He achieved this wealth and influence through parlaying familial, political, and faith-based transatlantic networks. Constance Sylvester was one of the transient sugar pioneers who sparked the transition to a sugar plantation economy in Barbados, which was wholly reliant upon enslaved labor. He, like other leading planters, successfully consolidated wealth, land ownership, and political influence to establish a plutocracy which dominated Barbados for centuries. Now, in this first slide, which all of you I'm sure are familiar with, we have what I would term the transatlantic highway through which goods and capital would have flowed from the Americas to Europe to Africa, etc. And with regard to the entrepreneurial career of Constance Sylvester, I will read a quote taken from Rachel Monroy's doctoral study on the trade winds of faith, Puritan networks in the making of an Atlantic world. And I quote, "Constant left Amsterdam for La Rochelle, France, where he purchased wine, spirits, and linen. He later traveled to the Cape Verde Islands and loaded livestock, including cows, donkeys, and horses. This cargo was then sold in the West Indies, and the ship was again loaded with tobacco, cotton, indigo, sugar, candied fruits, and beaver skin. Rather than traveling back to Amsterdam, probably to avoid paying duties, the ship returned to La Rochelle and then came back to Barbados carrying another shipment of wine and spirits." End of quote. So Constance Sylvester, who had grown up in wealth and privilege, came from a family of merchants. And when he arrived in Barbados with his clan, his father, brothers, etc., he quickly established businesses here, plantations, and he would have shipped sugar, rum, molasses, Barbados tar, and palm oil to New England. Now, who was Constance Sylvester? I must state that as it relates to the date of birth, the records give varying dates, but I went with this one, 1623. But in his relatively short life, he achieved much. And as you can see here, in 1651, along with a consortium of fellow Barbadian planters, he purchased the Shelter Island. And that is the reason why we are here, I believe. Now, when we take a look at the activity of Constant Sylvester, we need to bear in mind that it took place in a globalized economic framework, which was in its nascent stages in the early 16th century. And you had a convergence of capital and means from England, London, the capital. You also had the Dutch, who were instrumental, and you also had the Africans who were transported to Barbados and other islands to do the work on the plantations. Now, as it relates to London, London was critical in the development of the plantation economy in Barbados. It provided the superstructure as it relates to the governance and also finance and credit. The commission agents were stationed in London who were in charge of receiving the sugar, the rum, and the molasses from Barbados and selling it to persons throughout Europe and businesses, etc. So London linked finance with the Barbadian plantation economy. Now, we now move to Amsterdam. Amsterdam was Europe's financial capital, as Sir Hilary said so eloquently on Sunday evening. And it was so because Dutch merchants dominated shipping across the Baltic, Atlantic, and Indian Oceans. And Amsterdam turned into Europe's main commercial clearinghouse for goods and information. The financial architecture which was established in Amsterdam, an example being the Bank of Amsterdam, which was established in 1609, meant that traders and entrepreneurs and merchants felt safe and were willing to do business in Amsterdam. And what we find is that the Sylvester family, who had moved to Amsterdam, moved to Holland from England, they ensconced themselves in the business environment, the financial structure in Amsterdam. Now, this is a reconstruction of a ship called the Searob. Not sure if my Dutch pronunciation is correct. However, this was a ship with which Constant Sylvester had investments. And his father, Giles, as well as his brother, Nathaniel, the archival record shows, also had investments in ships. His father, Giles, owned a ship called the Sea Dog, and they were able, at an early stage, to try to control the networks of trade by investing in their own ships. So they were very keen on controlling costs by having an interest in the trade network. Now, as it relates to the shipping, I'll just read a little quote here. One of the most important English merchants in Amsterdam was Giles Sylvester, who had a trading company together with his brother Constant. Giles Sylvester was ship owner of the vessel, the Waterhound, and it also says that Sylvester was a charterer of the ship, the Planter, of the city of Medemblik. So the point I want to make here is that we have transnational commerce taking place. You have England, you have Holland, and you have Barbados, and eventually we will get to the United States. So what was the activity of Constant in Barbados? He was very ambitious, he was very aggressive in terms of the ownership of plantations, expanding his land holdings, purchasing large numbers of slaves, producing sugar, rum, and molasses. And he was so aggressive that his father complained to one of the leading planters of the day, James Drax, of the famous Drax Hall plantations. And this is the father complaining about the son. He's saying, I quote, "Take the conveyances of the said plantations, appurtenances and immunities, and for me in my name, and to use to take possession thereof." So the two quotes here are indicating that Constant, who was sent to Barbados and who was living in Barbados to take care of the family property, had taken it on for himself in terms of the ownership. So this is what the father is complaining about. Now, I mentioned that he was interested in amassing property because the idea was that the larger the plantations that you own, and once you operate them scientifically and efficiently, the more money you could make. So he went about purchasing plantations. The Mount Plantation was sold to Thomas Middleton and his partner Constance Sylvester. Remember Thomas Middleton, one of the four persons involved in the Shelter Island purchase. He also ensured that he married well. He married in 1653 to Grace Warren, the daughter of the powerful and rapscallion Humphrey Warren. And we see here that the early planters, they are melding together or coalescing wealth and political power. And this is something that is exemplified in other jurisdictions in later years. Now, technological innovation at Constant Plantation, the production of white sugar. Now, in one of the letters which is attributed to his brother, it states here that when Constant had been exiled from Barbados and he was on the plantation, that the plantation was producing white sugar. And the quote is here, "I had sent my brother 4 pots of white sugar and 3 more afterward." Now, this is critical because at that early juncture in the plantation economy of Barbados, muscovado or brown sugar was produced in the main. However, there were ingenious planters like Constance Sylvester who saw the financial benefits that could be accrued from producing white sugar. And what were these benefits? White sugar fetched a higher price. More molasses flowed from the curing process. White sugar was lower in weight, so you paid less for freight. And also, the more molasses that was produced, you could make more rum, which I'm a bit of an expert. Now, as my time is running out, I'll just conclude here. Constance Sylvester skillfully navigated Anglo-Dutch commercial networks in Barbados and in British North America to establish himself as a leading member of the plantocracy in Barbados. He epitomizes how enterprising merchants transitioned to estate ownership and enslavement during the heyday of Barbados's plantation economy model. His financial expertise, expansionist ideology, tenacity, and venture capitalism helped to critically refine the plantation economy matrix, which was subsequently replicated in other colonies within the British Atlantic. And I'll end here by indicating that the idea to purchase Shelter Island as a provisioning plantation was novel at the time. It was novel, but it made fundamental economic sense in that once again, you can control your costs and you can ensure that you have the supply of oak that you need, the meats that you need, etc. And in return, you can send the produce from your plantations in Barbados, Constant and Carmichael, to Shelter Island. So you have a hermetically sealed system of trade. Thank you very much. Okay, on this first slide here, we have a photograph of Constant Plantation Great House at the top, and I'm sure that many of you who went on the tour would have gone there. And we also have here at the bottom a photograph of the Shelter Island Great House or Estate House. And I had the opportunity to visit Shelter Island last year, And it was a very exhilarating experience because very often as a historian we read about these things, but we don't get to see them with our eyes. So these are the two photographs here.
Good afternoon, everyone. How's everybody doing? All right, so Achiri has really got the ball rolling. We want to congratulate him on that presentation and letting us know the kind of shrewd businessman that Constant was. But what about the people who are on the ground making this money for Constant? How did they respond? So I am tasked this afternoon with providing you with some of that information. I may require some technical assistance because despite my youthful appearance, I'm not tech savvy. So if the lady who assisted Achiri earlier is within earshot, yes, I need some assistance. While I'm waiting on that assistance, as Dr. Scott would have introduced me earlier, I'm a PhD candidate looking at the history of steel pan in Barbados. And while you would assume that this particular project does not align well with my research interests, you'd be surprised to find out that it indeed does. And there are fascinating links. One of the things about this particular project is growing up doing history in Barbados, we always heard about the Dutch influence early on, but we didn't put names to faces, as it were, and now we're getting to see who these people are, the networks, how they work together, and so on. So it's been fascinating research, and I'll tell you a little later how it ties into steel pan, but it seems that I'm on my own here, so let me see what I can do. Thank you very much. So here we are. Constant resistance. Slavery and resistance to servitude on Constant plantation between 16 and 1660. We're not going to stick to these dates slavishly. That just gives us a kind of a working window. So to borrow from Dr. Pettigrew, fasten your seatbelts. We have less than 10 minutes now, and we've got quite a bit to get through. So the first slave revolt plot. We already know the story of how the Constant brothers bought two plantations in Barbados, in the St. George Valley, which was a very fertile plain, perfect for growing sugarcane. And According to this quote, their focus on Barbados was in no small part due to their father, Giles, who was an English exile in Amsterdam, and there's evidence of him doing trade with Barbados in 1640. So as Achille would have said earlier, this is a network, a family network that is working between a number of different areas. The Constant plantation itself is around 515 acres, with around 200 enslaved Africans and 20 Irish indentured servants. As this quote says, most of whom were dedicated exclusively to the production of sugar. This is a consummate businessman, as efficient as possible. Nothing is to be wasted. Carmichael was a smaller operation of around 330 acres. It was on the former larger property that the first major slave revolt plot in Barbados would occur. What we are concerned with here in this brief presentation is what life was like on the Barbados plantations, particularly for the indentured servants and the enslaved. What were the key causes in this plot? What happened during and after the aborted revolt? And what were the outcomes of this first major attempt at assault on the plantation system? So the first quote here is from Richard Ligon, and is written in Old English. I will try my best to translate. The island is divided into three sorts of men: masters, servants, and slaves. The slaves are their property, being subject to their masters forever, and are kept and preserved with greater care than the servants, who are theirs for about 5 years, according to the laws of the island. So what Ligon is saying here is there are two types of labor present on this plantation: indentured servants and slaves. And he's saying that by some accounts, the servants are treated not as well as the slaves because their indentureship is a short period. However, we'll see how that narrative can be challenged as we continue. In 1636, Governor Hawley issued a proclamation stating that henceforth all blacks and Indians brought to the island and their offspring, critically, were to be received as lifelong slaves. So while we have two different types of servants, two different tenures of service, one is a lifelong condition, one is a tenured condition. So how do these two interact with each other, if at all? And how do they respond to the driving of Constant Sylvester in his urge to make maximum profits? So let's look at some of the causes of the revolt. And before I go there, I want to go back to, okay, I'll go with what I have here. Yeah, I was looking for something on the Indian servants, might be a little further, so we'll continue. So the population in Barbados changed dramatically with the rise of sugarcane. So according to this quote attributed to Michael Creighton, with the switch from tobacco small holdings to sugar plantations, the numbers of slaves had soared to 37,000, while the number of whites had fallen to 17,000. At least a third of whom were indentured servants. So if you're good at mathematics, you can work out 2/3 of that 17,000, these are the planter class, the others are indentured servants, and they're vastly outnumbered now by the enslaved majority on the plantation. A quote attributed to an anonymous author in an article published online says, as the slaves became more conscious of the advantages the majority population afforded them, they were said to become more rebellious and opposed to their conditions. So the enslaved persons are clearly understanding there's numerical superiority, and we have potential to do something about what is happening here. Another cause of the revolt was a desire for freedom. Another anonymous author, counter to the narrative that was being propagated by Ligon at the time, quoted a slave that showed how strange the African found plantation agriculture. And the quote is as follows: the devil was in the Englishman, that he makes everything work. He makes the Negro work, the horse work, the ass work, the wood work, the water work, and the windwork. And that quote is in Creighton as well. So these are people who are unaccustomed to being driven in this manner, despite some arguments that would suggest because they were accustomed to the tropical conditions, that tropical agriculture was a good fit. They were unaccustomed to being driven in this manner. The brutality of slavery was a leading cause of this first revolt plot, and I think it's best summed up in a quote by Beckles, where he says, sugar meant enslaved Africans as it did in Hispaniola and Brazil. The work regime was sustained with enslaved Africans. The work associated with sugar production was unusually burdensome because it involved a considerable manufacturing input on the plantation, as well as harsh agricultural labor. Workers were required not only to clear the ground of lush natural vegetation and to plant, tend, and harvest the sugarcane in the tropical sun, but also immediately to crush the juice from the cane in a sugar mill, and then to boil the juice in cauldrons before it had time to ferment. Work on a sugar plantation was arduous and labor-intensive throughout the year, but was particularly onerous at harvest time when the sugar works operated incessantly. So there's no time for rest once the sugar machine gets started. From the harvest to the crushing of the canes, the boiling of the juice to make the sugar, and as Beckers noted, the workers were organized on shift so that production was ongoing, it was never ending. Add to all of this negligence by the planters, where no land is being allocated for provisions to feed these enslaved Africans. So you are pushing people hard and you're not sustaining them. Something will break sooner or later. The events of the 1649 revolt, and as with any historical narrative, there are several accounts. This first one comes from Legon, and this is the interesting one, particularly for this project because it identifies Mr. Constantine Sylvester as one of the persons who would have lost property. The quote says 2 eminent planters in the island lost at least 10,000 pounds sterling in the value of canes that were burnt. The one, Mr. James Holdit, the other, Mr. Constantine Sylvester, and the latter had not only his canes burnt, but his house burnt to the ground. Now, there may be a message here. The fact that the enslaved persons did not only burn the canes, but they burnt his house to the ground. It would seem to me as though they were trying to drive him out of Barbados. Another account of the revolt says that the revolt erupted when provisions came scarce. And this is also important because, of course, we are going to see that Shelter Island is a provisioning plantation. So provisions were scarce, and some motivated slaves began to conspire. And listen to where the fire should have started. They planned to set fire to the boiling house of the plantation, as the boiling house was one of the cruelest places on the plantation. And the fire would also spread quickly from it. So there's a twofold advantage of starting the fire there. It is the most arduous labor on the plantation which you want to rid yourself of, and is also going to act as a propellant to get the plantation burnt as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, however, the plot, which had potential, the author noted, was sabotaged by faithful slaves who revealed it to the masters. And the final quote there, which ties back into the indentured servants, the chosen mode of destruction was arson. The indentured servants had used it on one occasion when they burnt Holdit's estate, and that disturbance occurred 2 years before the aborted slavery revolt plot. 2 years before the slave revolt plot, in 1647, the indentured servants rose up, and 2 years later, the enslaved Africans rose up to try to free themselves from miserable slavery. Another account says that in 1649, the African slaves made an attempt to throw off their bondage, and the boldest had planned a conspiracy to massacre all white inhabitants and make themselves masters of the island. Now, as I said, there are different accounts. There are some persons who were satisfied that it was a food riot, essentially because of scarcity. Some persons believed that the enslaved Africans had grander designs. Again, we see that informers included a number of Africans, and these were the persons who usually betrayed the revolt plots. Some of them, that last part of the quotation says, some of them were aberrant individuals who calculated erroneously the greater the betrayal, the greater the reward. It's important to note that manumission was offered to enslaved persons who betrayed revolt plots. So essentially, you could win your freedom by betraying a revolt plot. I remember this is the very first one here on Barbados, and by extension, one of the first in the Atlantic world. There is an argument that the planters were lulled into a false sense of security because they understood, and Ligon has a beautiful quote on this where he says that they're brought from different parts of Africa, and that was deliberately done so that there'll be a linguistic barrier and there'll be cultural barriers. And the Europeans knew that there were cultural barriers between different groups of Africans, and they made sure that they would try to mix them so that there were no concentrations, thereby reducing the chance to unite in a revolt. However, this argument has been challenged by Beckles and others, who notes that revolts did take place, plots were uncovered despite the differences in language and despite the differences in culture. So those arguments have been challenged. This is important to note. But what were the outcomes of this first aborted plot? Greater militarization, increased policing, and the expansion of malicious forces resulted from the failed insurrection, according to Beckles. And to bring it directly home to the Sylvesters again, in a letter dated 1651, one Sylvester to another. The author is a Giles Sylvester. It's important to note that Giles is the father. He also has a son named Giles, and I believe he has some grandchildren named Giles as well. So if one does not follow carefully, it is easy to get lost where that is concerned. But Giles is saying that the militia is demanding more soldiers, and he now has to quote, "They've taken 25 of my servants and made soldiers of them. And," this is the part of it she's annoyed, "I am still to pay them every month." So you have persons now, servants, interesting that they're servants, so not enslaved persons, but servants, that are being co-opted into the militia because they need to bolster their numbers to combat the unrest among the slave population. Madame Grace Sylvester also enters the record at this point, and the quotation goes as follows. Madame Grace Sylvester is on the January 6, 1679 militia list of Captain Stephen Brown. She's sending 3 men with arms for one plantation, and she appears again sending 15 soldiers for 510 acres in Captain Richard Salter's company. And it notes that she is the largest contributor. Now that 510 acres, I believe, represents the constant plantation, which we said earlier was around 515 acres. What else came out of this aborted revolt? Greater legislative control. A few years after the revolt, just over 10 years, we have the establishment of the 1661 Slave Code. And I'll quote a part of the preamble for the code, which was officially titled "An Act for the Better Ordering and Governing of the Negroes." And it says, "Whereas heretofore many good laws and ordinances have been made for the governing and regulating and ordering of the Negroes, in this isle, and sundry punishments appointed to many their misdemeanors, crimes, and offenses, which yet have not met the effect have been desired. So they need to bolster the legislation. They need to add some more. And they describe the Negroes as a heathenish, brutish, and an uncertain, dangerous kind of people, to whom, if surely anything, we may extend the legislative power given to us. So we need to govern these people. And this revolt in 1649 has shown that they have the potential to unite despite the differences in language and culture in an attempt to wrest their freedom. So the legislature is responding with greater controls in the 1661 Slave Code. Now this code, as we know, sets the blueprint for slave codes in the Atlantic world. On the legacy of this code, Beckles says, the 1661 Barbados Code was later applied almost clause by clause to Jamaica. The Antigua Slave Code of 1702 was also modeled after it. And he ends that by saying Barbados showed the rest of the English Caribbean not only how to manage profitable sugar plantations, but also how to legally control their slaves. This is a legacy of this particular plot. Finally, I wish to offer here that the purchase of a provisioning plantation in Long Island was no coincidence. Just 2 years after you had an aborted plot that was born out of scarcity. So this problem is now being eliminated. We already know the story of how the Sylvester brothers got together with Middleton and Rouse and they bought Shelter Island. But here is the interesting part. The latter part of the quote goes as follows, and this is attributed to Hayes. The motivation for the purchase of Shelter Island stemmed from the same source as the payment, as the four planters intended to develop the island as a provisioning plantation, a place to raise, process, procure, and warehouse supplies for the Barbados plantations, I beg your pardon, where all production efforts were given to sugar. It makes no sense to provision in Barbados that is acreage that could be in sugar. So in response to this scarcity, in response for the need to totally engage the acreage in sugar, they've purchased Shelter Island. So I won't read the conclusion verbatim because I think I'm close to the end of my time. But I will just start with the first paragraph. The events of 1649 were significant for several reasons, as I've outlined. The plot represented the first organized resistance of its kind to the brutal institution of plantation slavery. It revealed the thought processes of the indentured and the enslaved, who drew courage from their desire for freedom and the recognition of the numerical superiority, though this would not be enough for some, and that ultimately betrayed the revolt. Despite being essentially described as a food riot by some contemporary observers, it was noted that the cruelties of the plantation system would inevitably lead to revolt. This underscores the extent of human suffering which became necessary for the plantation to make profit. Freedom and freedom from cruelty were important goals of the plot. Resistance was present from the very start. Constant resistance. I thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just remembering to take off my chaperoning hat and put on my presenter's hat. And you're welcome. Thank you. It was a pleasure. And I'm here today to actually present my research project. Just letting you know that if you see me slip in between different dialogues, I'm actually either, scripting or presenting in my radio voice for Today in Cricket History or Today in Bajan History. But you all will figure it out. It's just that, the voices just changes as you narrate. As a proud person from St. George, this project is very important to me. When it officially came on board, I jumped on board because it not only gave me the opportunity to expand on my undergraduate thesis, which was on Dratsal, but it also created an avenue where I can do a micro-study on the St. George Valley, and so happens Constant and Carmichael is located in the St. George Valley. It's one thing that I would also like to see in this project is actually for persons who come to the study tour, they actually traverse the trail from Salters right up to Carmichael, where they would have the opportunity to view the various landscapes, including Constant, Carmichael. You would also see parts of the valley, Salters, and also Buckley, where you would then get a feel in terms of the various landscapes of how a landscapes would have changed over a period of time. My research topic is quite different from the others, but we're all meshed together. It is titled Sweet Profits, Bitter Labor, the Human and Economic Networks Linking the St. George Valley and Sylvester Manor in the Atlantic World, 1640 to 1838. My research examines the plantation economy of the St. George Valley in Barbados, along with the transatlantic provisioning relationship between Constant and Carmichael with the Sylvester Manor on Shelter Island between the time period of 1640 to 1838. Some argue that the valley's geographic advantage and infrastructural development enable its rise as a critical node in the Atlantic sugar economy, sustained by the exploitation of enslaved and indentured labor. Through archival, cartographic, and other analysis, the study reveals how economic networks mask the human cost of plantation capitalism by tracing familial and commercial ties, particularly those of Dratz, Rouse, Middleton, and the Sylvester families. The research reconstructs the cultural and material exchanges that link Barbados to New England and its contributes to the Atlantic world. The St. George Valley is often referred as the breadbasket of Barbados. It played a very pivotal role in the island's plantation economy during and after the Sugar Revolution. Its fertile soils, abundant water sources, and strategic location fostered the development of estates such as Brighton, Locasol, Dratsal, French's, Middleton Mount before it was renamed the Mount Plantation, Windsor, and then we have Constant and Carmichael. Yet while economic histories have celebrated the valley's productivity, they have frequently obscured the brutal labor systems that sustained it. My research seeks to redress that imbalance by foregrounding the human cost of plantation capitalism and situating the valley within a broader Atlantic network of production and provisioning. My guiding research questions for this research: how did the enslaved and indentured labor system sustain the plantation economy of the St. George Valley, and what were their social, cultural, and demographics impact? what was the nature of the provisioning relationship between Barbados and Sylvester Manor, and how did it reflect broader patterns of Atlantic trade and dependency? Lastly, how did transatlantic familial and commercial networks reinforce plantation capitalism and shape labor culture across Barbados and Shelter Island? So just a big background information, because our island in the early 1620s would have had its earliest form of investment, which was known as the 10,000 acre plot. In 1620s, the Earl of Carlisle was granted proprietary rights over the island of Barbados to finance colonization, where he allocated 10,000 acres to London merchants. One of those mainly was Sir William Courtine, who provided capital, ships, and even settlers. This land grant, known as the merchants' 10,000 acres, became concentrated in some areas around the island, but most of it concentrated within the area of the St. George Valley, laying the foundation for a plantation economy. These merchants were instrumental in establishing early plantations and their investments tied to Barbados to the financial networks of London. So we're here on a Constant and Carmichael project. However, for you to get a more understanding of the parish of St. George, there would have been plantations already inside of St. George, and Constant and Carmichael would have come after. We have Brighton Plantation, where once you traverse along the road, you would see Brighton Plantation, which was in 1630, owned by Thomas Wiltshire. There was also Locust Hall, 1631. As you all know, the famous Draxall, 1640. Around that time in 1640 was also French's Plantation, which was owned by John Spendlove. Middleton's Mount, or what we call the Mount, owned by Thomas Middleton, also sprang up in 1640. As you know, Middleton and Drax were also good friends and also neighbors on the neighboring plantation. Then there was Windsor, which came in 1643, which was owned by Gerald Hawtine, and these estates laid the groundwork for the valley's transformation into a sugar-producing powerhouse. Then came the introduction of Constant in 1650 and Carmichael in 1660, and respectively, they exemplified the consolidation of land, labor, and capital by the planter elite. Constant and Carmichael mainly linked to the Sylvester Manor in New York, illustrating the transatlantic nature of plantation capitalism. We did find other traces, especially on our last study tour when we journeyed to Rhode Island and Boston. We also found other connections there, and I hope that in future that we are able to expand on the research and we can map those trades and produce a journal context of these relations, especially during the transatlantic slave period. By the time Constant and Carmichael entered the chat, the valley was already in full production of planting. Some did tobacco, indigo, ginger, and some small scales like on cassava, maize, and yam. Do you know that after that, cotton came in after the decline of tobacco, and most likely it has been noted by James Drax in the work of Matthew Parker, Sugar Barons, of his first batch of field attempt of tobacco, and he then went into the diversification of sugarcane. The sugar revolution, as you did know, sprung up in between 1640 to 1670. The St. George Valley underwent a dramatic transformation. Now, the Dutch engineers introduced windmills, boiling houses, enabled industrial scale sugar production. James Drax's estate at Draxall became a model for sugar capitalism, triggering widespread deforestation and ecological change. The transition from tobacco and cotton to sugar was accompanied by a shift from indentured Irish labor to enslaved Africans. The valleys, gullies were engineered for drainage, and the ridges were terraced for cane cultivation, creating a regenerated plantation landscape system. And as a result, most of you, if you would have done the, know a bit more about Barbados history, you would know initially in the first stages, there were only 6 parishes on the island. So in 1629, under Governor Sir William Tifton, there would have been, Barbados was divided into 6 parishes. However, originally part of St. Michael, the parish of St. George gained formal status between 1640 to 1645, where Captain John Swan was commissioned to survey and establish boundaries, resulting in St. George emerging with 1,215 acres more than St. Michael. Now, there is a hypothesis in terms of that, because they do know that Governor Hawley was friends with the Drats and others, so they were wondering how St. George gained more land than St. Michael. Apart from that, between this time period, there was a dramatic transformation of sugar revolution here in Barbados, but also in the colonial metropole, there was a war going on. The English Civil War between 1642 to 1651 destabilized England and its colonies. Barbados, a royalist stronghold, became a refuge for exiles and a site of resistance to Parliament. Governor Henry Hawley, who was notorious for land seizures and favoritism, his allies, James Draps, Thomas Middleton, Thomas Rouse, and the Sylvesters, benefited from redistributed lands and expanded their holdings. These relationships entrenched a planter class and extended their influence across the Atlantic. By mid-17th century, Thomas Rouse, Middleton, Constant, and Nathaniel Sylvester purchased Shelter Island, a small landmass off the coast of New York. This acquisition was a strategic move for autonomy, economic diversification, and political refuge. Shelter Island became a provisioning plantation supplying food and materials to the Constant and Carmichael estate. This purchase also symbolized elite power, as owning an island represented dominion and control over land and labor. But we're not only looking at that, but we're also looking around this time how sugar became a major currency during that time period. As sugar became more than a commodity, it functioned as a form of currency. Planters used sugar to pay for debt, secure credit, conduct trade. It became the basis of the wealth and financial transactions, embedding Barbados into global commercial networks. Barbados sugar exports were exchanged for enslaved Africans, provisions from North America, and manufactured goods from England. This triangular trade made the island a critical node in the Atlantic economy, linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Sugar was the engine that sustained these transatlantic exchanges. The immense wealth generated by sugar allowed Barbadian planters to wield political influence in London. They lobbied for favorable trade laws and shaped imperial policy. Fluctuations in sugar prices had a ripple effect across the Atlantic, underscoring Barbados' centrality in global commerce. Sugar in Barbados was not merely an agricultural product, it was currency, capital, and power. It structured the island's economy, shaped its society, and positioned Barbados as a dominant force in the Atlantic world. As you know, that the 4 wealthy planters were able to purchase Shelter Island with 1,600 pounds of Muscovado sugar. The transformation of the St. George Valley from a forested interior into a regimented plantation escape was neither accidental nor isolated. It was a deliberate outcome of capital investment, deeply embedded in the structures of Atlantic capitalism. The planters' elite pursuit of autonomy and expansion, exemplified by their acquisition of Shelter Island, reveals the transatlantic dimensions of their ambition and the ways in which local landscapes were bound to global networks of trade, power, and dependency. Now, with my research, I hope within a year or 2 years max that is completed, my research aimed to extend beyond the valley's boundaries to fulfill and reconstruct the provisioning relationships between Constant and Carmichael, along with the Sylvester Manor, by examining deeds, titles, shipping records, and familiar ties. The project will map the flows of goods, people, and ideas that link these two sites. It will also interrogate comparative labor structures, exploring how enslaved and indentured workers sustained both economies and how their experiences were obscured by the profits of empire. The final product of this research will be a comprehensive narrative that situates St. George Parish within the wider Atlantic world, bridging further relations through Rhode Island, Boston, and in doing so, I hope my work not only contribute to scholarly debates on plantation capitalism, but also serve as an act of remembrance, inscribing the story of St. George in a broader historical record and offering future generations a deeper understanding of the human and environmental costs of cane sugar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlin. Quickly, I want to make some observations, and then we'll go to the next panel. And after the next panel, if we have time, we have a big, wide open discussion, because I really want to have our Shelter Island folks present in detail. Quickly, your point about model is an excellent point. I hope we could share on that point about the model. For example, the merchants that came after, we have Cavens Lane in Bridgetown. We have Bale and Lubbock. Those are some of the early merchants that emerged out of Barbados and went to the other territories. Then the issue about governance, Lord Willoughby, Professor Beckles raised it. And Willoughby, I need to tell you, appointed Calinago as the first lieutenant governor of Dominica around 1660. His name was Indian Warner. Then fire, Apollo, there's a book by Bonham Richardson, where he looks at the role of fire in the region. Bonham Richardson, he is a historical geographer. And finally, your point, Carlin, about landscapes is a point that many people seem to forget, because Barbados as a flat country, Antigua as a flat country, St. Kitts as a flat country is in the earliest model, but then later on, when you go to the more mountainous countries, because you have already developed this model of how to supply food, Apollo and Acheri, that is good, how to supply food. So one of the things we need to widen our examination on is the dietary practices. And again, Dr. Denny would tell you this is something that we are working on for St. Vincent, particularly looking at the breadfruit in the second part. Thank you very much. I will invite the Shelter Island friends, and we'll have a wide discussion at the end. Thank you so much. A round of applause.
Oh, you, yes, okay, sorry, let me have,
So you have them both?
yes. Okay, I'm going first?
Yeah, you're going first.
Okay.
First, I'll just introduce you guys. So you can sit
Yeah,
a
yeah.
minute and yeah. You wanna put it up? Yeah. There we go. That should come up there. On, the mic is on, yeah. Put this on. Sugars. Yes, I'm good. You're good? All right, great. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Are you hearing me all the way in the back? Good afternoon again. I'm hearing a little fatigue in the voices, so one more time. Good afternoon, everyone. All right. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Risa Noel McBarnett, and I am the head of site at the UWI Global Campus in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So I'll just tell you a few things about me briefly before we get into the meat of the matter this afternoon. So prior to my current role as head of site in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, I served as the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Tourism, Civil Aviation, Sustainable Development in my home country, and I also had earlier roles in the classroom, so classroom teaching, curriculum development, and public sector administration. I am a proud alumna, of the UWI Cayfield campus, yes, the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom, and the University of Auckland in New Zealand. And just two fun facts about our site in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We have the relics of an aqueduct system from an old cotton ginnery, so that's on our sites. If you ever have an opportunity like Kizzy to visit our site, you would see the relics of our old aqueduct system there. And also, our Vice Chancellor of the UWI, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, he referred to our site as the crown and the jewel of the Global Campus sites. Yes, we deserve a round of applause. Thank you. All right, so before I get into things, I would like to extend my profound gratitude to Dr. Cleve Scott and Dr. Henderson Carter for the invitation to participate in this conference. Yes, kudos to the team. All right, so our session this afternoon is titled Shelter Island as a Provisioning Operation. And on our distinguished panel, I have here with me, with us, Donna Marie Barnes, and I'll introduce each panelist briefly. So Donna Marie is a dedicated historian and curator with a deep commitment to preserving and sharing the stories of the enslaved and free people of color of Long Island. Her work at Sylvester Manor Educational Farm has been instrumental in uncovering the lives and identities of these communities. Please give it up for Donna Marie. Alice Clark. Alice is a dedicated history and heritage associate and event planner at Sylvester Manor Educational Farm, located in Shelter Island, New York. With a background in English literature and social studies, Alice has been instrumental in researching and coordinating historical programs. Her work has focused on identifying the names and stories of enslaved and free people of color buried in the Afro-Indigenous burial ground at Sylvester Manor. Alice Clark. And Steve, Dr. Steve Mrzowski, thank you. You wouldn't believe last night I was on Google typing in how to pronounce your name. Yes, but thank you for that. I appreciate you very much. So Dr. Steve is a historical archaeologist and the founding director of the of the Andrew Fisk Memorial Center for Archaeological Research at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. His research focuses on the growth of complex societies and the roles of colonization, urbanization, and industrialization in shaping the modern world. And give it up for Dr. Steve. And you're probably wondering where I got these pieces of information from. I did my research. All right, so, yes. Each speaker will have 15 minutes to present, but I'm told that Donna Marie will present, and then, of course, Alice, you would be able to, when the questions come, you would be able to assist Donna Marie there. And so after Donna Marie, we'll have Dr. Steve, all right, and you have 15 minutes each. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, please give our presenters a round of applause, and please give them your attention. Thank you.
Okay, let me just share this space. Oops. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us. This is really very wonderful to see you all here, and the presenters that we've heard in the past 2 days have been extraordinary, and I congratulate all of the work. And I promise this time I won't cry. Well, I won't promise, but I'm just going to see which cursor I'm using to advance the slides. Okay. Does that work? I think I just need to know how to advance the slides. Let's try that. No, that's just the pointer. It's up. It's there, but it's stuck. Stuck? Technology, we can't live without it. We just don't know how to work it. There was a problem earlier about where the cursor, where's the other gentleman? Okay, so there, but it's not moving. Okay, anyway, we're going to come back to that, you know, pictures and stuff, so I'll just start talking. How's that sound? So today we're going to talk a little bit about Shelter Island, Sylvester Manor, and the work that we do there. And I'll give you a little bit of the history of our other island. Sylvester Manor is an island on the eastern end of Long Island in New York and was the ancestral territory of the Manhasset people. They were part of the indigenous tribal system of the east end of Long Island, and the Manhassets inhabited this land for thousands of years, engaging in hunting, fishing, farming, and maintaining connections with their familiar clans across the region. Pardon? Okay, restarting. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. I'm just finding my place. The name Shelter Island is the English translation of the native name Manhansak Ahakwash Awamak. It takes us a long time to figure out how to say that, and even longer of how to spell it. It means island sheltered by islands. Are we getting there? Okay. As Shelter Island sits between the two forks at the tip of Long Island. Today, there are no people who identify themselves as Manhassets, as they were absorbed by their clans and other neighboring tribal groups, such as the Montaukets, the Shinnecock, and the Kurtchak, after leaving Sylvester Manor, or Shelter Island, sorry. Hard to do. All right. Oh, okay, let's see. Got this, okay. All right, I'm just going to tell the story as we tell the story. As we have heard, near the mid-17th century, the land in the New World was being divided sight unseen by European powers. And in 1638, Long Island was bestowed to the Earl of Stirling by King Charles I of England. Excuse me. It was in recognition of his services to the crown. In turn, the Duke had his man of business, James Farragut, select a piece of the island for himself, and he chose Shelter Island and the neighboring Robbins Island. He, in turn, then sold these two islands to a Connecticut businessman named Stephen Goodyear. Still, none of these Englishmen visited the island. Okay. You think you have it? During the same period in Barbados, yay? Okay, yay! Okay, here we go. Here we go. Sorry. This is how it goes. Let's see. There we go. Shelter Island. Wait, sorry. I have to go back to where it's written down. Island, shelter by islands. This is okay. So, at the same time, in the mid-1600s, as we have heard, sugar was introduced on the island of Barbados. And soon, it became the greatest cash crop in the world, with all of the land being dedicated to the growth of sugar, worked by transported Africans who were enslaved to do the labor. Oh, sorry. Okay. The four partners who were plantation owners on Barbados, Thomas Rouse, Thomas Middleton, and the Anglo-Dutch brothers, Nathaniel Sylvester and his brother Constant, decided to band together and form a partnership and buy an alternate location that would serve as their provisioning plantation and I'm sorry, my text has gotten all screwed up. This is so bad. So I'm just going to wing it. We're going to wing it. There we go. Screw that. Okay. Constant and Carmichael, owned by the Sylvester family. They were also parliamentarians, and during the English Civil War, they were in fear of exile, which they were, and they needed an alternate location for which to hide. And so they knew a guy who owned an island, as we say. Thank you, Alice. You're welcome. And they contacted him, and for 1,600 pounds of good Muscovado sugar, they purchased the 8,000 acres of Shelter Island and decided this was where they would build a settlement. However, the indigenous people of the island had had enough contact with the Europeans for Englishmen to know that they had certain legal recourse. And so, because they were against the sale, they took the partners to court in a New Haven, Connecticut court, and unbelievably, they won their suit, forcing the partners to rebuy the island, this time for 800 pounds of sugar and a quantity of cloth, with the provision that the Manhanses either agreed to work for the plantation or to leave the island. We don't know at this time whether the Manhansets considered this to be a permanent course of action, but they did leave the island, the majority of them, and were absorbed by their other tribal clans of the Montaukets, the Shinnecock, and the Korchucks. We refer to this period as the provisioning era under the supervision of Nathaniel Sylvester, and they produced wheat, peas, corn, raised horses, harvested oak barrels, and pipe staves and other necessary goods, and shipped all of these south to Barbados while sugar flowed north and east. For 11 generations, over 3 centuries, the descendants of Nathaniel Sylvester would go on to live and be landowners on diminishing acreage on Shelter Island on the property known as Sylvester Manor. We are so out of sync. The nonprofit organization Sylvester Manor Educational Farm was established by Sylvester descendants in 2009 and today is known simply as Sylvester Manor. The present property consists of 236 acres of land, a Georgian-style manor house built in 1737 by Nathaniel's grandson Brinley Sylvester, outbuildings, and the continuation of a working farm. It remains the most intact plantation remnant north of Virginia. Our organization's mission is to cultivate, preserve, and share historic Sylvester Manor, telling the stories of all of the people who lived, worked, and died here, and sustaining the land for generations to come. As an organization, we maintain a year-round staff of 15 people, and in summer season, when our farm stand, art installations, and youth programming are operational, we have a staff of 80. Our public programming includes tours of the historic manor house, gardens, and grounds. We hold musical concerts on the lawn, theater performances, and talks by authors and scholars. Seasonally, we welcome 20,000 visitors to our site. In our tour narratives and in all of our printed material and talks, we have always spoken of the historical connections between Barbados, Shelter Island, and Sylvester Manor. It is a part of our origin story. And over the past 2 years, with funding from the Mellon Foundation, we have been able to go deeper into the history and the research of the African people who were enslaved at Sylvester Manor, and of the generations who continue to live, work, and die there as free people of color. But as we learn more and more information and identify new individuals to our narrative, we come back to the beginnings of the story and the questions surrounding the first Africans brought from Barbados to work on the provisioning plantation, who we consider the founding non-Indigenous ancestors of the island. As we work to trace the people who were brought not just to Sylvester Manor, but also to the general region of the East End, the connections to the West Indies become stronger and more apparent. The questions become more relevant, and the need to know, who were they? What were their names? Where did they come from? How did they get here? Becomes more important to us and to our story. And the Sylvester family themselves, with their connection to the Atlantic world, from the Netherlands to the Caribbean to Shelter Island, and the Northeast, has become a focal point of our research. Throughout our journeys into the past, we have always been aided and guided by the archaeological work done by the University of Massachusetts and the Fisk Center for Archaeological Research. For close to 30 years, they have laid the groundwork of uncovering the buried past at Sylvester Manor. Through the artifacts found on the grounds, we've been able to find their stories, from the bones of the animals raised and slaughtered to send to Barbados, and the simple household items such as needles and pins, clay pipes and buttons that indicate the work done at the manor and the lives lived there. For the past 2 years, Alice Clark and I have delved into the archives held at Sylvester Manor itself, at the Sylvester Manor Archive held at NYU's Fels Library, at the Dutch National Archives in Amsterdam and The Hague, the National Archive in London at Kew, along with archive collections held at Oxford University and Cambridge University, where the original letter that we heard about in the last program panel written by the 18-year-old Giles Sylvester, the youngest brother of Constant and Nathaniel, is held, as well as early transcriptions of the letter itself. It was very exciting. This week, while we have been here in Barbados, we visited the National Archives, and we continue our research. In each place, we have found them. Mentions and documents relating to Nathaniel and Constance Sylvester, along with their family businesses. Archives tell the story of the settlement of the Constant plantation and how the family made a financial and land ownership success that was passed down through generations in Barbados and in England in much the same way Sylvester Manor on Shelter Island was passed down to the descendants of Nathaniel and Grizel Sylvester. We have learned of the role Nathaniel played here on Barbados as a commissioner appointed by Governor Daniel Searle before settling on Shelter Island, and of the role of the youngest Sylvester brother Giles, who lived here managing Constant plantation while his brothers were away in exile, to the part he played in England later in life, where he was involved in outlawing the persecution of Quakers by King Charles II. Over the next months, we will continue our Mellon Foundation project of research into the past of the Sylvester family and those who lived, worked, and died on their properties. We continue to interpret that information into the stories and histories to tell and share with our various communities and with our visiting public. Our partnerships with all of our academic partners have become extremely important to us. And it's through the work being done by all of these amazing students that we have heard from over the past 2 days that the future of Sylvester Manor will be built and continue as an important historical site for generations to come. Thank you for your attention and patience this afternoon, and for your support for this amazing project, and to the success of our first Constant Carmichael Project Conference. We look forward to all of the work ahead. Thank you. Oh, stop. Is this you?
Yeah.
Look at me.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, try.
What do I, that, okay. Okay.
Excuse me?
Ah,
See if it's working.
yeah, okay. Thank you. And I want to thank everybody for all your work in organizing everything. And as always, as I've gotten to experience many times with my visits to this wonderful island, your amazing hospitality. You would not get this kind of treatment if you come to Boston, I can tell you that. Yeah, that's just the reality of the situation. So there's a lot to talk about. So I'm going to try to do this as fast as I can, and I may speed in, but I want to start by pointing out, so what is it that we do as historical archaeologists? And two very important things. First, we deal with very different scales. We deal with a scale of the global that connects Amsterdam to Barbados to Shelter Island. And we think of those connections in that scale as the scale of global capitalism. And what I'm going to show you today is we contrast that with the intimate scale of daily life that only archaeology, did I say that? Only archaeology? That archaeology is very good at revealing. Now, you have to take a little bit of faith in knowing that what I'm going to say is backed up by empirical information, and it is. So, I also am going to be able to answer some of the questions that were asked today.
So what was the experience? What was the daily experience of those that lived and worked and died there on Shelter Island? And it was different. The archaeology revealed something we did not know. We expected, we hoped to find the Sylvesters and their enslaved laborers, but what we didn't expect and we found was that the indigenous populations were there and played an important role, okay? So a few things about the Sylvesters that you've gotten to see today. The Sylvesters were born and raised in wonderful Amsterdam. And this is the Single in Amsterdam, which is one of the first canals. And their house that they lived in is right there. Right there. Their father was a tobacco merchant. Now let me explain what that means, because I didn't know this until I spent quite a bit of time in Amsterdam. Amsterdam was the seat of early capitalism. So every day at 12 o'clock, for 4 hours, all the merchants would go to the major center where was the stock exchange. And they would do nothing but talk and trade, watching prices go up and go down. And they brought commodities from all over the world to their warehouses, and they just sat there, hoping that everything would go up and go down. And this was a ruthless business. And you saw some of that in the wonderful presentations today about the relationship between Giles, or as the Dutch say, Hillis, and his own sons. So when that voyage goes back to La Rochelle, the Dutch East India Company at the time, not West India Company yet, contacts the father and says, what's going on? Why didn't you come to Amsterdam? You owe us money. And he said, don't talk to me, talk to my son. And the same thing happens many times. Then so Giles dies in 1670, Constant dies in 1671. In 1674, the Dutch retake New York. They come to Shelter Island, they surround the manor, and they demand payment for the island once again. Nathaniel agrees with one provision. Everybody else is cut out. Middleton, Rouse, now his brother is dead, but his family, they're cut out. He's the sole owner. So here we have a notion of what capitalism can do even within the family, okay? So what I want to do now is I want to address and show you, I'm going to put this over here, what the archaeology reveals, all right? So imagine Amsterdam, and here it is, beautiful Amsterdam. And this is all the testing that we've done. So every little cross you see are archaeological test pits. The pink ones are the newest. Here's the house. Here's the house. And this is our cemetery that we've been working on. So as you can see, we've done a lot of digging. Here's a close-up of the work that we did in front of the manor house, which is circa 1730. And what you can see here, everything you see is the 17th century plantation core. And we're going to talk a lot about this area and this wonderful area here in just a second. But this is where we find the evidence of daily life. Mrs. Fisk was a wonderful benefactor. She allowed us to dig up her front lawn. And she brought something new to the work we did. She used lights to illuminate it at night. So when her friends visited, they could see it. And it was, yeah, it was that kind of an experience for us, okay? Here you see the remains of 17th century buildings. Here, here, here. And this is a wonderful, oh, no, we'll get to that later. I'm gonna go to this one, here. This wonderful paved service from the 1660s, and we can demonstrate that archaeologically, which is part of the landscape when he gets manorial control. So he now becomes the lord of the manor, which means he's his own government. All right? Now we'll go back just a minute to this. Nope, this one. So let's talk first about, nope, I'm gonna go back one more. Sorry to keep doing this. This right here, this large feature that you see here. It is a slaughter pit that we found. Just to give you an idea, here's a nice little array of bone. I love this. This is a 1948 water line that cut right through it. We don't love that. All the bone. And this is what a nice bone area looks like in one of our screens. Okay, 13 large pigs slaughtered, each generating 800 pounds of meat. There was a treatise written about Montserrat plantations with a formula to explain how much you needed to support your enslaved populations. This combined meat would have supplied constant plantation for 6 months. So this is exactly why I loved everything that I heard today, especially the connection with the revolts, because it's true, this became a major provisioning plantation for those plantations. We also found the remains of an early building that was robbed out. That's what this is, this trench. So this was one of the early houses that would have housed, it would have been a workhouse for both enslaved workers but also indigenous workers. And we did a combination of pollen analysis, paleoethnobotanical analysis, seeds, and all of the material that we were able to find, including these copper beads and this wonderful thimble that's turned into a little tinker, we call it, which would have been on the ankle of an indigenous person. So they're not only living there, they're making their own materials and making wampum as part of the whole operation. And here's, once again, our wonderful paving stone. And this is the features. Again, I'm going to talk a little bit, or I just talked about this feature, which was the building that was taken out, and then this. And one of the questions that we had when we started was a simple one. Who were the Sylvesters? Were they Dutch? Were they English? The material culture tells a very definitive story in this regard. This is the arms of Amsterdam German stoneware. All right, so this is being made in Germany for the Amsterdam market and then being shipped, in this case, to the Sylvesters. This is one of our favorite things. We found lots of these. This is a Sir Walter Raleigh pipe stem. The Dutch hated Sir Walter Raleigh, so much so that they created a pipe to represent him. The head, the bowl of the pipe was his head, and this was an alligator eating him. Okay? We found, I think, 60 of these. Well, Enoch would know, but don't say anything because maybe you'll contradict me. So this would have been a very popular pipe for the Dutch. We also found lots of evidence of the Sylvesters. This wonderful gold-gilded men's coat button with tulips. This is a wonderful fleur-de-lis silver hairpin. And this is our wonderful Manhasset pot. Is that the last? Oh, no, here's the tinkler, and then I think, So the question that one of the questions was asked, what does resistance look like? Where can we see the indigenous people? Where can we see the enslaved people? These are the indigenous people speaking to us. This is a Thunderbird sign, all right? And we found this on 2 artifacts. So somebody did this while they were working there and while they were being watched. Because this will fit in anybody's hand. It fits very comfortably. We used to joke on the site that it was the pass to go to the bathroom. And the Thunderbird motif that's on this and another coin is very much an indigenous spiritual. sign. Where we saw the coming together, oh, yeah, here's the other one. It's on a large etching here, and this is on the Spanish cob. So this is speaking to us about the resistance, if you will, of the indigenous people. Now, this is not a revolt. This is not an attempt to take over. This is just daily reaffirmation of their identity being etched into the stone and into this Spanish cob. We also found lots of evidence on the island of indigenous sites going back to the 14th century. We came to Barbados to Constant Plantation, as you can see here, the beautiful house, the St. George's Valley, and those wonderful soils. But in the early 20th century, the Sylvester descendants decided to remake the landscape of Sylvester Manor. And they did a curious thing. The archaeology that we did showed we sought out a separate living area for the black folks. We never found one, because one doesn't exist. They're all living together in the same basic complex. And the archaeology absolutely reveals that the foodways are melding together, all right? So you have certain foods that are being eaten that everybody's eating, and that was not a surprise, but what was a surprise was some of the fallen material that we found, the bones, that showed that they were being produced, made in a very African way, all right? So that's what the archaeology revealed, a life of everyone working together. Now, this is not going to be portrayed as some kind of like, oh, everybody's getting along. No. These are enslaved people, all right? They're property. But on a daily basis, they're interacting with one another. They are living and they're working with one another, and that also comes through. Yet, in the early 20th century, when the descendants of the Sylvesters decide it's time to remake the landscape, they divide everybody. So the Sylvesters are one place, the indigenous Manhassan are another place, and here is the burial ground for the enslaved population, which we are now working in. Not digging. We don't dig graves anymore. Not here. Okay, I'm almost done. We use all this wonderful modern technology that lets us see the grave shafts. Here we have some ground penetrating radar. But I'm going to end with this pot, because this pot is empirical evidence of the melding of all three populations coming together. It's an indigenous pot whose style is very consistent with all the indigenous pottery being made in Connecticut, in eastern New York at the time. It has a handle, which was being put on that because the indigenous folks didn't have handles on their pots because it made no sense. That's not how they used them. But the English did. But most importantly, this is with a temper of shell, which is a very indigenous process. But the shell was roasted, which is not an indigenous process, but it's an African process. So as Donna Marie knows what I'm going to say now, to me, when we think in the United States, and we have a lot to deal with historically, and in the present as well, as we know, you have to sometimes come to grips with not the history you wish you had, but the history you have. One of the good things that has come out of the crazy histories that all of these folks have shared, and the people of Barbados have shared, is art. And in the United States context, jazz is one of the few truly hybrid Creole products. Well, that's what this is, all right? This is a Creole product that shows the coming together. So our work will continue, and I just want to thank everybody who spoke today, because it's so exciting to hear this side, and we can now see how our work fits in for the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to our presenters. We now open the floor for questions. I see Dr. Denny with his hand raised. If you can go to the microphone in the middle of the room.
Where are we going to dinner tonight?
Let's begin. Yeah, let's begin with the last piece of detail, rather interesting and perhaps astonishing detail that we have about people living together, and it demands an explanation. Okay, since it is a curious phenomenon, and so I do have a piece of detail and hence a question that flows from it. One of the things that that the original purchasers of Shelter Island did when they sent Nathaniel on his way, they gave him some rather rigid instructions about what he could do and what he could not do, how many cows he could have, how long, you got to take 6 years before you kill one, and all these kind of things. But they also included instructions about what kind of house he should live in, how many rooms they should have. So my question is that constraint on the actual living conditions which he could have, is that a potential explanation as to why we have people living together in Shelter Island, whereas in Barbados, this in fact would not have happened because the brother and the other business guy said, we want to limit you to 6 rooms. That's what they said. We want to limit you to X number of buildings and you cannot do more. That's my question.
You want to do that?
Yeah, no, you go ahead.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yes. So thank you for that question. That's very interesting. I think one of the things that we consider on Shelter Island is where it's located. It's on the eastern tip of Long Island, as we said. When the partners purchased it in 1651, other than the Manhasset people, there were no other inhabitants of the island, of the 8,000 acres. Coming from Barbados, Nathaniel himself would have been used to winters from living in Amsterdam, but bringing the enslaved Africans with them, they would not have had encountered winter weather before. And so having this settlement around what we call the plantation core, where everyone lives and works together, this was not an estate, this was a commercial enterprise. They were not there to build, they did build a big house, but the reason for the 6 or 7 rooms was not for luxury or to limit an expression of luxury. It was because Middleton and Roust, as well as Constant Sylvester, thought that they might have to actually go and live there. So the house had to be big enough to accommodate the 4 partners and whoever they brought with them, as well as probably some of the workers who would be working in the house. So the very nature of what this settlement was dictated how they lived on the landscape. The core section of where the house was built, or where we believe the house was built, and where the majority of the commercial work was being done, as well as the from slaughtering the animals to then transversing them across what is now the lawn to the water, to the rowing boats, crafts that would lead them to the deeper anchorage where the bigger ships would be harbored to come back to Barbados. All of this was very centrally located, as well as a substantial fresh water supply. So I hope that helps understand just how this settlement really happened in this small space where everyone then did live together.
Yeah, so let me just follow up on that too, because it's an important question, because it's the question we started with. Mm-hmm. In other words, where's everybody living? We were surprised with what we found. We looked everywhere that we could for additional living areas, but one of the things that was interesting about the archaeology, and we just proved this again, was just last summer when we opened up a whole new area, is everything is concentrated in this one area. So all of the buildings and all of the activities really seem to be concentrated right in what we call the core. So I think there were 24 enslaved Africans that they had. Most of them, we imagine, were domestics or skilled workers. So they're not field workers. There's not a lot of field work going on here. They're collecting barrel staves. They're collecting fruits. They're collecting luxury goods from places like Newport, and mostly livestock that they're slaughtering, barreling, and sending it down. And so, for starters, there wasn't this large, group of enslaved folks like there was at Constant and Carmichael, where there were hundreds. Here, 24. I don't imagine many were living in the house, although I'm sure at least a few were, the ones who were taking care of Nathaniel and Grizel's large number of kids. But they were most likely living in the stables or the barns and a kitchen. So I think the concentration is because they understand that this is a moment of actual peril. They're English, and they're living in what just had been a Dutch colony, then becomes an English colony. And the indigenous people on either side of them, some are friendly and others are quite hostile. So I think it's both defense, it's efficiency, and one of the things that we'd like to think about, that we wonder, because we've seen this in Virginia, is that the assumption that most of us have always made about these colonial folks is that they came to stay. But the architecture and the archaeology doesn't support that. So we're not sure how long the Sylvesters expected to have to stay there. They may have been planning on living. Some of the buildings that we found are impermanent buildings. They're not designed to last. So, we're as surprised as you are by those results. And I don't want to give anybody the wrong impression that we're trying to portray this as some, area, people living together where there weren't absolute barriers for interaction. But the archaeology reveals a story of a tightly intertwined group who are living and working pretty much in the same spot.
Okay, thank you. Another question?
No. Observation and something that might consider.
Okay.
Now, we have to think about mentalities. When we study, Donna Marie, relationship between Native Americans and the earliest colonists, whether in the Chesapeake region, we are told that we had amicable relations. And much later, you have more controversial relations, okay? Now, we know that when we come to the region, especially Barbados, during the period of the tobacco farms, everybody worked together. And Professor Beckles underscored that yesterday. For example, if you read Dunn, Sugar and Slaves, Anderson, Sugar and Slaves, right? Dunn. You find that the earliest relationships were always described as being familiar. They always use the term that it was being like a family. It is only in the region when enslavement became the preferred source of labor that you have all of this problematic relationship. So I don't know if you have considered, but what about the mentality? Which is, when you are in Barbados, and we take it easy, or you're in Trinidad, where's Dr. McCollin? In Trinidad, everybody lime, right, Dr. McCollin? So we are limers, we take it easy, but when we get into the subway in New York, everybody have to move fast, right? So the mentality, think about mentality. Something to consider. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Scott. Yes, go ahead, Jennifer. Oh, before Jennifer, yes, go ahead.
Hi, everybody, it's Enoch here. So my question is a pretty long one, but I hope it gets answered. And once again, this is to the general house. So my first question is, what is the relationship between the plantocracy of Barbados like? Was it one of cooperation competition or what I call strategic mutualism, in the sense that they joined forces when it suited their mutual interest. And then my second question is that which is more like a follow-up to the first one. So so we learned from Sir Hilary's presentation that Constant was very innovative, when he got here. And I was wondering, did perhaps his Dutch connections, give him an advantage over the other planters in Barbados? And when I talk about advantage, I'm referring to capital, because we also learned earlier that Amsterdam was like the Wall Street of that time, right? And so did his Dutch connections give him that advantage, and also in terms of technology, building the windmills and all of that? So I'm curious about how his Dutch connections, influenced his enterprise in that regard. My final question is, sorry guys. So my final question is, we know that in Shelter Island, the Sylvester Manor has been in the family for generations, and forgive my ignorance on the Constant and Carmichael plantation, but I'm curious to know how long did the property stay in the family, and how long did the property stay in the family, and what was the relationship between
the two?
Between the owners of how was the relationship between the latter Sylvesters across both sides like? Thank you.
Great question. It's a great question because we just found that out. Do you want to say?
Starting with your last question first, we do know that the Constant and Carmichael stayed in the family through until the 20th century. I think it was 1909, right? Yes, that was when the descendants of Constance Sylvester held through the families of the Sylvesters, the Warsums, the Prettyjohns were all descendants of Constance Sylvester. Was that? Oh, yeah, Pickering and Warsum were the same time. Those were the people, the names of the daughters married, Constance's daughters married. So then the next family to own it is the Robinson family, who are the current owners. So it really has only stayed through 2 bloodlines over time. That's the third question. The second question, you want to take the Dutch?
Oh, wait, tell them. And the Sylvesters, the same family has owned that up until now.
Right. So from 1651 to 2009.
So you asked what was the connection?
What's the relationship between?
Yes. So it's very interesting. We are very blessed at Sylvester Manor that we have such an extensive documented archive. Although the early period, the 17th century, the provisioning era, we have very scarce archive and documentation. But later generations never wrote on a piece of paper that they didn't keep. So we have thousands of letters and documents and account books and inventories and last wills and testaments and notes and histories that descendants themselves wrote about the family, about the island, about their legacy. And a lot of those histories, when they talk about, they acknowledge the connection to Barbados, but they don't know a lot about it. They don't really know how that really happened, except that they owned a sugar plantation in Barbados, and then they bought Shelter Island. And as far as we can tell so far, there was very limited knowledge of that connection in later generations. So we have a letter from the 18th century written by a Sylvester descendant through marriage, the Lloyd family, and they're communicating with the Warsums on Shelter Island about a dispute about Grace Sylvester, Constance's wife's will, and who owns what and who owes who what. And after the 18th century, we have not yet found any other documentation of a connection or an acknowledgement of each other. Some of the photographs that I showed are of Constant Plantation taken in 1922, when a Sylvester descendant from Shelter Island, actually he lived upstate, a Deering descendant came to Barbados to visit, and all of these photographs were in what we call our storage vault, and on the back of them was written notations of the date that they were taken, and that they were of Constance Plantation, the windmill, and the smokestack, and of Middleton's Mount. So there's very limited, at present time, because we still have letters and envelopes we haven't taken out yet, of an acknowledgement and connection between these two families. In our narrative and how we tell the story, we always say that after Nathaniel's grandson, Brinley Sylvester, the name gets lost in history because the property descends through the female line. And we have very strong histories of women throughout the centuries of Nathaniel and Grizzle Sylvester's descendants, as well as a parallel history of women, of the enslaved women and free women of color of Sylvester Manor. And now, finding out about the ownership of Constant, we can see again that parallel history of the properties descending through the female descendants.
One of the more interesting things that I think in terms of two things. One, there's not a lot of evidence past the deaths of Nathaniel and Grizel of any more direct connections. So in other words, the provisioning piece of this seems to end by the end of the 17th century. But I think more importantly, getting back to some of these larger issues, is the fact that even into the early 20th century, descendants of the enslaved folks, when it's coming time for their lives to end, they are returning to Shelter Island to be buried in the cemetery there. So there's got to be a strong connection between those spaces. And again, I don't want anybody to interpret this as something like everything was great. It's still slavery, and slavery continued well into the 19th century at the manor. So let's not.
Thank you all for these presentations, and also for the earlier session as well. So I have a thought that might turn into a question, but that is trying to navigate us through. In Emma Griffin's presentation this morning, she talked about the fact that the English and the Dutch archive is constructed in such a way as to erase the presence of Black people, right? We who work on the history of slavery all know that we're in like a battle with the archive. And we then have the melding of three cultures pot, which kind of, you know, it might appear to contradict something that we know about the history of slavery. But part of what the field is producing right now is a recognition of the way that slavery underpins capitalism, and we've heard that again and again, that the origins of racial capitalism are, the origins of capitalism are in race. And part of what the Sylvester family shows us is that this family can move far away from Barbados, right? And can live in proximity with the people who they enslave. And proximity is not the same as melding, is not the same as intimacy, but it is something, and we have to figure out what that something is. They can do that while simultaneously building an infrastructure that is absolutely about supporting a complicated plantation-based racial complex, right? So that these things are not contradictions, like the melding of three cultures, the return of Black people to Sylvester Manor Cemetery, is about the ways in which connections can be rooted in land, can be rooted in some individuals, and yet can also live side by side with like profound racial violence. Because of course the provisioning, those 13 pigs, right? That's about profound racial violence, because that's about making it so that a bunch of people who are enslaved on Barbados have just enough energy to continue to cultivate sugar. So it's like, I think that I certainly had like a, ugh, when I saw the word melding, right? But I understand what this pot shows us. It shows us proximity, and it shows us the fact that indigenous and African and European descendant people lived in proximity and borrowed from each other in ways. But it also shows us that there's this underlying tension and reality, which is racism and racial violence and hereditary racial slavery and racial capitalism. So I want us to keep this thing in mind, that the English and the Dutch and the French don't want to leave records of their violence, right? And then I had one final thing to say. I was thinking about Apollo, about the informants, right? And we who write about slave revolts, we are pretty willing to accept that characterizing of a person informing on a revolt. We say there were informants. But I think we need to also make room for the fact that the slave owners want to blame, to divide, and want to make it, to say, well, there are people who are loyal to us. And therefore, they will write a story in which they were informed of a plot rather than other ways in which the plot was revealed or was, interfered with, et cetera. So again, I think we need to be really careful about what our archives are leading us to say. And I'm sorry, that was very long, but.
Well, can I just?
Thank you, yes, round of applause. So we have a response before, Dr. Denny, if you could just allow.
Well, can I just respond to that?
Respond to Jennifer first, and then you can pose the question.
I think we're better letting me speak because I'm adding on to her.
Oh, okay, he's extending. Okay, thank you.
I'm reminded of Professor Beckles in the opening.
On Sunday.
Yes. And he spoke about the invention of chattel slavery. And Barbados is place in the invention of chattel slavery. And that this invention was extraordinary in terms of its capacity to transform the idea of what it means to be a human being. Okay? And so the very same people who are in that place on Shelter Island, they are the ones writing those laws in Barbados. So this transformation of the human being into a commodity, okay, that we see that is at the center of this new invention of what it means to be a slave. And the physical intimacy that we see in Shelter Island, these two things undercut one another. Which do we trust? We go back, when I say undercut, what I mean by this is that the intimacy isn't genuine in terms of a connection, a belief in the humanity. So what we have to trust is the idea of the laws themselves that commodify the human being. So I'm also reminded of Dr. Scott making the point that we have to think of the mentality, the perspective, the ideas that are here, and not simply, we can't just, we have to read into these actions what kinds of mentality is driving these ideas. And so it seems to me that, that if one looks at Shelter Island, one of the things that I've said about St. Vincent and the Grenadines is that in the history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, that our geography imposes upon us an intimacy. The island is so small that we cannot escape one another, whether you're white, black, blue, green, yellow, whatever the case might be, rich or poor, that at the end of the day, the geography imposes an intimacy. It seems to me that Shelter Island is much more than St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Okay? And so that geography produces an intimacy that is a function of geographic determinism rather than some kind of, well, we have some real capacity or willingness to live with you and treat you as human beings.
I just have to say one thing.
All right, we've started an academic battle here, yes? It's a conversation. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to make sure that I'm not misunderstood. I actually was saying the exact same thing. What I'm saying is that intimacy is not about affect. It's not about feeling. It's about It's about
Proximity.
and that it can coexist with incredible racial violence.
That is why I say I agree with you.
Okay, I agree with you. All right, then we're good.
Yes, can we clap for the agreements? Yes, thank you.
Okay, so just 2 points of clarification. One, your interpretation of intimacy is the correct one in my mind. It wasn't meant as that they had an intimacy of relationships. It was a spatial intimacy that was imposed upon them. But also, my use of the word melding isn't, I use melding in the sense of the pot is melded, okay, using those processes. It's not a coming together of them like, hey, do this and we do that. And by the way, we have other evidence of that kind of interaction between the indigenous and the Africans.
All right, thank you. So we do have time, I'm told, for more questions. So please go ahead, give us your name and your question or comments.
My name is Margaret Harris, recently graduate.
Can you come closer to the microphone and speak a little louder?
My name is Margaret Harris.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Margaret Harris,
Yes.
recently graduated from the Faculty of Cultural Studies. Not a
Congratulations, yes, congratulations.
I'm not a historian, and therefore I'm not here to argue the finite points about the history of Shelter Manor, but two questions do occur to me, and did occur to me as I was listening to the panelists. In relation specifically to the archaeological history of Shelter Manor that you have, or Sylvester Manor that you have encountered, did you find any artifacts that pointed to punishment, the nature of punishment, if there was punishment? Presumably, because Shelter Island is a provisional island for the enslaved. I'm not sure if the indigenous people were also enslaved, but enslavement presumes punishment. So is there any evidence to show that there may have been instances of punishment? That's first question.
She's asking archaeological.
No.
No.
There is none.
Right.
There's none that we know for sure that's what it is, but no. And by the way, we know what that looks like because we have found it at other sites.
Right.
So.
The other question, and of course you can't expand beyond that because simply you didn't find anything, but the other question is, and in my little reading that I did do, there were other provisioning plantations. What are some of the main differences and or similarities between Sylvester Manor and these other plantations within the United States? Yeah.
Well, the ones that I know, which are mainly in Connecticut and Rhode Island, they're very similar. The only thing that is unique, but just to my knowledge, is the direct connection with the same family.
Yes.
You know, in other words, like they buy Shelter Island directly to provision Constant and Carmichael. Mm-hmm. The entire Rhode Island economy, the Newport economy in particular, but also Connecticut, was all devoted to provisioning Caribbean plantations. I mean, it's why it was booming for them. You know, lots of, and that's why I mentioned the luxury goods, furniture, horses. There was a particular kind of horse called the Narragansett Pacer that was designed for the planters. Silver, jewelry, clothing, you name it. Everything was being shipped to Barbados and other Caribbean islands.
If you were to surmise, I guess, what would you say, and sorry, I'm just gonna finish now. What would you say was the main reason? I mean, if there was another reason besides the commercial venture, the mercantile venture, which we all know was, undergirded the plantation economy and the rise of the racialized culture, what would you say could have contributed from undertaking Cleve's point, which I think is very important, the mentalities and emotions behind this other form of a colonial experience? What would you say would would be the other reasons, or any other reason?
Yeah, that's a good question. As Steve said, we don't know whether Nathaniel Sylvester, in the beginning, considered that he would stay on Shelter Island, that he would grow, become the lord of the island. When the Dutch come back and he pledges allegiance to them, and we always make a joke about it when we tell this story, that the Dutch come and suddenly Nathaniel is once again, no, I'm a Dutchman. I speak Dutch, I grew up in Amsterdam, but when the English come back, then he's suddenly, I'm an Englishman. And they actually have to but they have to apply to Parliament in England to become naturalized English citizens. I think once he becomes the owner of the entire property, once the provisioning to Barbados starts to lessen, once his brother Constant dies, and Constant had returned to England, I think probably the idea of staying on Shelter Island, of becoming part of this new colony, of making his fortune there, his instructions to his sons in his last will and testament was never sell the land. Keep the land, use it, own the island. But the sons did not have his business sense. I think growing up in Amsterdam, having a merchant father like Giles Sylvester who sent his sons off into the world to do business. He sends Nathaniel on the Sarobi as the supercargo. He goes to France, he goes to Africa. He spends a year in Virginia learning about growing tobacco and doing business in the colonies before he goes to Barbados. So he has become a world traveler. He has a Atlantic world view that he doesn't give to his sons. He keeps them on this island, this insulated little island, along with the indigenous people and the enslaved people. The nearest other European colonists are across the water or 30 miles away in Southampton. So they are really alone in this environment. And the sons don't have the world experience. They don't become businessmen. They squander their inheritance. They do sell the land, and they end up losing the bulk of it.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Dr. Harris. Next question, please. Give us your name and your question or comments.
Okay, hi, my name is Ree Donna Vickers. I'm a student of history at UE. My question is, Doctor, you mentioned remote sensing at Constant Plantation. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, both techniques and results of that, please?
Could you repeat your question, please?
Oh, our digging at Constant?
I think
yes.
Oh.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, I found it the most difficult excavating I've ever encountered because of the thickness of the soils. We did find in the fields that were plowed evidence of different groups of folks living. So I think the archaeological evidence of the enslaved people is there. But we were really challenged by the actual soils because of the combination of coral base, and so I would say the archaeologists failed. We failed. And I think the local archaeologists here would have done a much better job than we did because archaeologists are used to what they're used to. Is that what you wanted to know?
Yeah. I also wanted to know, are there any reports that we could read?
No.
Okay.
No. Well, and I'll tell you why, because we were there for a week, and we wrote I actually do have a small sort of write-up of what we did that if you want I can send you. But I'd like to say that I always wanted to be an archaeologist from as early as I can tell. And even today, if anybody in my family loses something, I set my sights to find it. So I like being able to be a successful archaeologist, but I was not successful at Constant, I have to admit.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for wonderful presentations. My name is Debbie McCullin, and I'm from the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, the land of the lime.
Yes, big up UE, St. Augustine.
My question is very simple, and I haven't heard enough about it, I think, throughout the conference. Thank you, Donna Marie, for introducing it to a certain extent in some of your comments. I'd like to hear more about the presence of women, their role and their contributions, and what is coming out of the documentary and the archaeological evidence. You know, the wives of the men that owned these plantations, the indigenous women, and of course the enslaved women. So if you could speak to that, please. Thank you.
Sure. So part of the way that we work in conjunction with the archaeological team is that they examine the science of the artifacts. Alice and I interpret it in terms of who was there and trying to make personalities to imagine who lived there and what their names were. So as Steve mentioned, in Nathaniel Sylvester's 1680 Last Will and Testament, he names 24 enslaved people. He divides them by family, what we consider husband and wives and their children. 24, the majority of them are children. He bequeaths them to his children. And so part of what we've done is that we've looked at the ages of Nathaniel's children when he died, who ranged in age from 8 years old to 22 years old, and considered that they could be in correspondence to the enslaved children. So, in other words, that there were a large number of children growing up in this mid to late 17th century at Sylvester Manor. The names of the husbands and wives, we don't know how they became husbands and wives, whether the men came first and women were brought later, whether they were forcibly coupled together, whether they were coupled by choice, circumstance. These are questions that come up for us in real time. I was giving a tour, and I say every tour, there were 24 enslaved people separated by families, husbands and wives, and I had to stop. And I said, you know what? I don't know how they became husbands and wives. And I just assume that they were. I don't really know. I know their names as couples, Tamro and Oyo, who we believe may have come from born in Africa because of their names, that they may have been Nigerian. Hannah and Jakero and their young daughter Hope. Hope would have been the first non-Indigenous child of Shelter Island. She was brought there, we don't know her age, but she was brought to Shelter Island from Barbados. So Hope is our founding child. We know the name of the first child to get off of the Mayflower. I can't remember it at the moment. Virginia Dare, could be. Hope is the first child of Shelter Island. Grizzle and Nathaniel Sylvester went on to have 11 children who grew to adulthood. Similarly, the enslaved children lived very long lives, and they are all buried at the what we call the Afro-Indigenous burial ground. Hannah was the slave woman of Nathaniel's wife, Grizzle, who came to Shelter Island with Grizzle as her own property. It is because of Hannah that Grizzle successfully delivered 11 children who lived and survived to adulthood. And so in telling her story, the way that we do, we have to imagine who was this woman? Why was she important? And why was then Grizzle a success as a wife and a mother? So we have to imagine that Grizzle's brother bought Hannah, Jakero, and Hope for Grizzle to bring with her. Was Hannah of childbearing age, so that Hope would have been a young girl, maybe 5 years old? So she had an experience of pregnancy and childbirth and of rearing a young child. Perhaps she had domestic skills, so she could work in the house, she could cook, she could sew, she could use the needles and the thimbles that the archaeology found. And most importantly, perhaps she spoke English sufficiently that Grizzle, who was 16 years old and had newly come from her home in London, where her father worked for the king, she was, as I always call her, a city girl. She knew nothing of living in the wilderness, and it's only because of Hannah and her experience with her that she survived. And so as we get more and more facts, as the archaeologists uncover more artifacts that we then spin stories out of and do imaginings, and we fill in the names, the lives of the people who lived at Sylvester Manor and on Shelter Island become fuller. So I hope that answers part of that question. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, if you look down the line and you look at family correspondence, we do pull out more detail about the lives of the enslaved women and free people of color that lived at Sylvester Manor. We find out, in some cases, who makes cheese, who works in the dairy, who has a particular skill set of weaving. So from the labor perspective, we do get more information. And then from the family correspondence, sometimes we get the detail of what their lives look like, their personal lives. Dido met a man. Dido married this man. This man is cheap. You know, like, and this was in what?
1830.
1830. So she's not enslaved anymore. She's been free, but the family is still talking about Dido in their family letters. So those are just pieces where we can sort of reconstruct her humanity and her story through that.
So I just want to say one last thing, because I think it's important. For most of its history, archaeology has been part of the imperial enterprise. It's part of settler colonialism. It is not sought to find the hidden histories of the people who were oppressed. It has sought to glorify, and throughout most of its history in North America, it focused on the indigenous peoples without ever collaborating with the indigenous peoples, without ever talking to the indigenous peoples. That has changed. All the work that we do now in North America is through collaboration with our indigenous partners. It's their history, it's not ours. And if we don't treat them with respect and work collaboratively with them, the enterprise of archaeology has no future. The same is true of women. Especially, we collaborate with indigenous folks on the Sylvester Manor project, and many of the leaders are women. And we're using archaeology now to counter the United States government's attempt to deny indigenous people their due process by pointing out to them that we can find archaeological evidence of continuing political continuity up until the present, but through the female line. So I'm not afraid to acknowledge that archaeology has not done its job up until the last maybe 20 years. But that's changing. And I think it's really amazing that we get to come here today and listen to all of you and learn from all of you. Because this history is difficult and it's painful. And I spent a lot of time in the Netherlands, and they are having a very difficult time. They can't keep referring to the Golden Age anymore when they realize all the people who died as a process. So it's important that we struggle with that history and struggle with these kinds of questions, and that we're put to the test of answering those questions. Because in the past, nobody ever really bothered to ask us. So I appreciate the kinds of questions that we got today, and we'll continue to improve the way we do it and do it for the right reasons.
Yes. On that note, I just wanted to say that we have, in 2019, we started a new project of advanced ground penetrating radar in our burial ground, in the Afro-Indigenous burial ground, and we do that work in a partnership with the Shinnecock Tribal Nation. Because this is their ancestral land. As I mentioned when I was speaking, there are no people who identify as Manhansets. They were absorbed by the other local tribal peoples. And so the Shinnecock and the Montaukett people consider Shelter Island their ancestral home, and we welcome them as such, and everything that we do there, we hope to do in collaboration with them and with respect to them and their history.
Okay, thank you so much for your responses. We are really out of time. We will take one last question, not a multi-part question. One question, please. Thank you.
It came just in time in that case. Not a question. First of all, congrats to the panel, all of the panels that would have presented. But I wanted to attempt to answer the question asked by this young man earlier. It's a two-part question, so allow me some latitude. So the first part of that, he asked about what advantages the Sylvester brothers would have had coming to Barbados, being the connections they had through their father and being Dutch and so on. There would have been some advantage because, as you would have heard from Professor Beckles, the Dutch were driven out of Brazil and they brought their technology to Barbados. So being Dutch, they would have benefited from that. However, if you read The Sugar Barons, Matthew Parker, you should consult that. Text. Holdit is credited as being the first planter in Barbados to plant sugar, James Holdit. And he also appears in the narrative where his plantation was burnt, but by indentured servants. Drax, and I think Carolyn's research will support this as well. Drax was really the man in Barbados when it came to sugar. He had the technology before some of the others, and we were told that he held it rather close to his chest initially. But then, as you see, you start to see partnerships form, as you saw with the Sylvester brothers, Rose and Milton coming together to have a provisioning plantation rather than buying provisions. It made more sense. And if you think about it, it's really the economics of it. It made more sense to control the provisioning rather than outsource and spend money. Imagine that Shelter Island is 8,000 acres, he said?
Roughly, yeah.
8,000 acres to supply a 1,515-acre plantation. And let's assume that there are 4 of them. It's still less. But it made more sense to do it out there and import the things than to do it. The last thing I want to say is the narrative about resistance is a very complex one. So caution is advice. So when you're reading persons like Ligon, who's a primary source, he was an observer, he was there. He's writing with a lens of a primary observer. He was friends with Middleton and Rouse and Sylvesters. So that's the perspective he's writing from. If you want to have some much later interrogation, similar to what Dr. Denny and Dr. Scott would have introduced into the discussion, you really should read Black Rebellion in Barbados by Henry Beckles. He has about 2 or 3 chapters where he goes into rebellion, the dynamics of rebellion. Of course, you did have different groups of enslaved persons. There is evidence of large cultural groups coming together, like in the 1617 revolt in Barbados, and that was a very significant one, and it's tied to us here at Cave Hill, so I think it's a fitting note on which to end. The golden stool, the administration building you would have seen on your tour of Cave Hill, that is built in the shape of the golden stool of the Asante Hene. And in 1675, had that revolt succeeded, there was an African called Kofi who was intended to be enshrined on the said stool. So I hope that answers Enoch's questions and gives us something to mull over as we move into our wind down from today.
Thank you so much. Just in closing, I'm going to tell a short story because that's what we do. When we photograph the artifacts that are portrayed in the catalog that we passed out on Sunday, and including this photograph of the pot, we gather it at UMass, and the curator brought out all of the artifacts that we had chosen that were going to be in an exhibition to take back to Sylvester Manor for the first time since they had come out of the ground. And I was especially excited to see the pot, as we call it, and to photograph it. And we put it on this pedestal, and my photographer friend turned on his photo lights, and the lights hit the pot that was on top of this black draping, and everybody in the room went, "Oh," because this pot radiated magnificence and majesty. And it's the story that Steve tells about it from the archaeological point of view, of how it was designed and what it represents in terms of indigenous pottery and the techniques of how it was fired according to African traditions and the presence of the handle and the European use of handles. All of that is true. But in seeing this pot on this pedestal, my breath was taken away, but then I had this thought, because they were also talking about how the pot had been found in the ground at Sylvester Manor, and it came out almost looking just like this as one piece. And I turned to everyone and I said, how did it get there? How did it get in the ground like that? Did a woman carry it as part of her work one day? And one day she had just had enough and she couldn't carry it one more step and she couldn't put one more thing in it, and she dropped it in the mud and said, it's broken. Was that her act of resistance? Was that her act of rebellion? Was that her act of expression of just not wanting to do this anymore? And the only avenue that she had was to drop the pot intact into the hole, for it to be found 375 years later. So when we look at all of these artifacts and when we hear all these stories and we tell the stories of all these names, in our imagining of the lives that were lived there at Sylvester Manor on Shelter Island, these are the questions that we ask. So again, I'm going to say, Faresa, thank you so much for having us, for these wonderful questions this afternoon, for this wonderful, wonderful, powerful, and important conference that we're all participating in. And have a very good evening.
All right, so please give a round of applause to our presenters, Donna Marie, Steve, and Alice. And also to our audience, you've been great. We're out of time, unfortunately. I know that there are some persons who wanted to pose questions, but perhaps you can have a chat with our presenters afterwards. So Dr. Cleve Scott, he has some housekeeping matters for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Risa Noel McBarnett. Don Marie, don't move yet. Steve, don't move yet. There are certain things we have to tell you because we know you don't know everything. Firstly, we have been to Shelter Island twice. We took 10 students in June, and we took another 10 in October. And both times we had an extensive tour of the facilities. We went in the farm, we surveyed every square inch. Secondly, Steve was doing archaeology at Shelter Island in June, so our students were able to observe the archaeologists at work. And Steve is the head of the Fisk Center. I pronounce that right? Oh, yeah. I've been practicing. And the Fisk Center, where we went in October, it's in Boston. We toured the entire facility. It is very sophisticated, very sophisticated. Our students had an opportunity to see everything, how they sort, how they catalog, everything. So they have been doing tremendous archaeological work, and our students in the future will continue to visit both institutions. I just want you to know that. It is not just we invited Don Marie, Alice, and Steve. And don't bother with Steve. He gave us a reception at Boston that was second to none. We were wined and dined, and we had protesters too to welcome us. Let's say it again for the Thank you very much. Dr. Carter, please come tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Cleve. I want to say how thrilled I am with these panelists over the last 2 days. I want to give them a big round of applause. Very good information indeed. Lots of information shared. At lunch, I received a call from Professor Sahilary, and he reminded me that the Carmichael plantation is now in the hands of Sagicor. We're now in the Sagicor School of Business. Now, he is a board member of Sagicor, and the chancellor is the president of Sagicor. And he has said that he will do everything in his power to give us access to Carmichael and see whether we could find a burial ground and he has given me a task to find the slave list at Carmichael, because he thinks that is going to be important going forward in convincing Sagicor to give us that access. So that's really good news. Tomorrow we will go there, first at Constant, then Carmichael, then over to the Newton enslaved burial ground, then over to the Quaker burial ground, where we will see the grave of a man who was buried in 1700, and then finally to the Morgan Lewis windmill. We're hoping to leave Morgan Lewis at about 1:30, then we arrive at Apes Hill at Cleve's house for lunch around 2 or so. But we start early in the morning. We leave Hilton and Radisson at 9:30. So come out to meet the bus at about 9:25. All right? So that 9:30 on the dot, we're off through the country, in the valley, and over the hills to... Over the hills, yes, over the hills, and down the hills. Barbados is not flat. We will show you that there's a lot of hills, Cleve. So I want you to enjoy the remainder of the evening. Go and get a little sea bath down at Pebbles, walk the beaches, and get some sunshine as well, and prepare yourself for tomorrow. Andrea Richard here, who is our resident archaeologist, is going to take us through the cane fields tomorrow. So make sure you have your walking shoes. She'll take us through the cane fields at Constant, hoping to find that burial ground that you've identified, and Carmichael as well. And she's also going to take us through the bush at Newton. So we are in for a good ride tomorrow. I want to wish you a wonderful evening. Thanks very much for this session and these sessions over the last 3 days. Really, really very informative. Have a good evening, everybody.
Yeah, that's